Welcome to Parashat Shemot, Sefer Shemot. Very exciting to start a new parasha. I'd like to dedicate our learning today on behalf of our former student, Mrs. Esther Adis Aleha Shalom. She recently passed, but this was the week that she always sponsored the class in memory of her grandmother, Lulu Bat Salha, and her mother, Selma Bat Lulu, who both had the same Yortzeit date. I'd also like to dedicate our learning today in honor of my husband, Morris, because whenever I say Moshe, Moshe, he says Hineni. And so with that, let's get started. I entitled the class Shemot, the bush is still burning. I believe that Sefer Shemot highlights the dichotomy between change and stasis, between movement and status quo. And I think that's what the bush is going to represent for us, but I think there's a much bigger picture for us. So whereas the bush, for instance, is ignited and inflamed, at the same time, it's still a bush. And we start to get these two contrasting ideas. On the one side, we get the sense from Sefer Shemot that everything old is new again, meaning that even though it's something that was, it is renewed, it is transformed. We see change, we see activity and growth, but we also get the sense all this is happening at the same time. So I want to get the sense of the tensions and the directions that we're being pulled in all at the same time simultaneously. So in the one sense, we get this paru vayishritzu vayirbu, we have all of this movement going on, but then we also have this ein chadash tachat hashemesh feeling, whereas the more things change, the more they stay the same. We're still back right here. We're going to go straight into the Pesukim. We thought we moved on, and here we go. The same old, telling us who the children of Yaakov are, naming them. We don't seem to feel that there's enough of a change. So let's look at it together. The Sefer starts out with the Vav HaChibur. It's the only Sefer that starts with the Vav, Ve'ele Shemot B'nei Yisrael. If anything, maybe there is a change because the children here are going to be called the children of Yisrael. Haba'im Mitzrayma, that are coming towards Mitzrayim, et Yaakov. We want to say with Yaakov. They probably should have said im Yaakov, and we'll talk about that. And then we have this term ish ubeto ba'u. There's actually a lot taking place in these words. The Vav of the Ve'ele is telling us you cannot have this new beginning without it being connected to what was. It's the Torah's way of beckoning us back and making sure that we brought the old story into this story. And they're going to tell us the Shemot of Bnei Yisrael. It's going to highlight first and foremost the developed Yaakov into Yisrael, which is the national name for him. And then we have these words like Haba'im Mitzrayma. It seems to be in the present. It's as if they're still coming to Mitzrayim, and they're coming et Yaakov instead of im Yaakov. And then the last piece, we wouldn't really need ish ubeto ba'u, that each man came with his family. I feel that might be a little bit of a redundancy, except if we realize that this first pasuk is already laying the blueprint for us of what it's going to take or why we merited coming out of Egypt. What do I mean by that? Shemot, you've heard this midrash or this idea in the past. One of the things that we kept as a people were our Shemot, our Hebrew names. So Ele Shemot Bnei Israel. We kept our names. Haba'im Mitzrayma means that we never actually felt that we arrived. We were always still in some way, shape, or form connected. We're still Haba'im. When we're still in the movement of coming, it means we haven't fully left. For our purposes, we would say that we kept a lot of our traditions, our language, our heritage. We're still not settled into Mitzrayim. We're still attached to the motherland. And when it says Et Yaakov, the commentaries say a beautiful thing. They say it should have said Im Yaakov, but Et Yaakov means they came as one with Yaakov, meaning that no one part, like the body, if you hurt one finger, the whole hand hurts. You can't hurt one part of the organism without the entire organism feeling it. So they explain Et Yaakov, meaning that they came together as a united unit, like Yaakov, like a person would be one united self. And as such, they wouldn't fall prey to their past Lashon Haras and their past backstabbings and whatever else had gone. There was a sense of unity. And so we're starting to see a pattern emerge. And that is, if we want the Geulah, if we want the redemption, if we want to merit the redemption, this verse is telling us, keep your names. Keep a connection to the motherland, because if you sever that connection, it's going to be very hard to go back there. And stay as a unit, as a family, like Yaakov and Ish ubeto ba'u, they say speaks of each man came with his family. They're really talking about the sanctity of the home. That one of the important factors in order for the redemption to take place is there has to be family purity. There has to be, and we'll see next week that the preparations for the redemption is all going to take place in the bayit. The inside of the house has to be a mini sanctuary. And so they talk about Ishu Beto, everybody stick together with your family. There has to be a sense of morality and purity in the household. And so this pasuk starts giving us the clues of how we're going to leave Mitzrayim, and then it goes into the repetitiveness of Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zevulun, Binyamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. I'm mentioning them to you and I'm reading them to you so that somewhere in your brain, you could be saying, been there, done that. So that's one side is the Torah is establishing. Yes, we're going back to where we've been. It's the same old, same old. And it says, and all the nefesh that came out of Yaakov was shiv'im nefesh, and Yosef was already in Mitzrayim. None of this is new. Yosef and all of his brothers died. We knew that last week. They all died. That whole generation died. And then we have this movement. So on the one hand, where we've been all along, and the next we start to feel paru, vayishritzu, vayirbu, vayatzmu, b'me'od, me'od, vatemale haaretz otam. Even the fact that we are proliferating profusely, whereas before we vaya'achazuba, we had held on. I believe it was in the end of Vayigash. These same words actually appear at the end of Vayigash, where it says, Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim. Be'eretz Goshen, Vaye'achazuba vayifru vayirbu me'od. So this is a continuation, except it seems that before they were in control of the land, they were holding on the land, to the land. But now, vatemale haaretz, the land is now taking on anthropomorphic energies, and the land is filling them as opposed to them filling the land. And actually, the commentaries play with it both ways. They say they filled the land, they got this little piece of Goshen and they spread out tremendously. But at the same time, the land filling them means that they started to become inculcated with the Egyptian culture. Again, both, you can read most of these Pesukim in two opposing ways. Here's where it starts to get interesting. This Vayakom Melech Chadash al Mitzrayim, a new king arises on Mitzrayim that did not either know, recognize, remember, chose not to remember. There are a lot of commentaries. I read a beautiful article written by, let me see if I wrote it down here, Rabbi Michael Hatin. His article is in the Torah Haretzion website, and he gives a very interesting geological account of where they were geographically at this time. And he explains that the Nile runs through the Sahara Desert. Its origins are in Africa and stretches to the Mediterranean Sea. And he said that ancient Egypt was actually split. There was Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And the Lower Egypt was this triangular marshland. It was called the Delta, and that's where our story takes place, in the Lower Egypt region. And since the Nile, we've heard in many midrashim also, it used to overflow once a year. Paro used to assume, or have the people assume, that he was the god that made it overflow. But regardless, the Nile and its pharaoh were worshipped as gods. And now, speaking specifically about the Paro of Yosef, I Googled this, and Rabbi Hatin also cites this. He says that Yosef was the viceroy at around 16 BCE. And at that time, it was believed that foreign invaders from Asia Minor,
I really think we have to walk.
come in, that foreign invaders from Asia Minor had come in and overpowered the Egyptian kings. They seized the throne, and now, when at the time of Yosef, that Paro was a Paro that had come from a different region. So whereas the original Egyptians may have been much more homogeneous or xenophobic and not have wanted a Semite to come and be in their midst, the foreign kings weren't as, they were much more open to that. These foreign kings were known as the shepherd kings. If you want to Google it, the name of the king is Hyksos, Hyksos, and this sort of paved the way for Yosef to be able to thrive, because he was a foreigner, his brothers were foreigners, but they themselves were foreigners, these kings, and that's why they were tolerated. And Goshen, where our story is going to take place, is also in that Lower Egypt Delta region. That's where the center of control was. This new king that they're talking about now in Shemot, Vayakom Melech Chadash, was believed to be Ramses II. He was known as the Great Builder, and it's the 18th dynasty, and his kingdom is actually called the New Kingdom. So Melech Chadash, New Kingdom. And now with this backdrop, I'm hoping we'll understand where this anti-foreigner, perhaps even paranoia, would emerge. Because for the past 200 years, they were under the rule of these foreign shepherd kings. And now that they finally are rid of them and they have a person, a homeborn, actual purebred Egyptian on the throne, they want to make sure, now we'll understand what he says and why he says it, they want to make sure that they are not subject to the fear of a foreign force taking control over them again. And here we go. So we have this idea now that let's read a little bit more. It says, Vayomer el amo. This is what he's going to tell his people. So think to yourself, it's a new day, it's a new kingship, new monarchy taking place. He's going to tell his people, it's a good thing we got rid of the foreign kings from Asia Minor, but our job here is not yet done. So it's possible that this Melech Chadash that doesn't know Yosef, he doesn't know Yosef, doesn't recognize Yosef, but also doesn't recognize the fact that all of these outsiders are now encroaching in his land. And look how quickly we go from, he tells his people, Hine am b'nei Israel. I always say this. Notice how quickly they go from being am b'nei Israel to, and he calls them Rav ve'atzum mimenu. You're not going to hear the name b'nei Israel for a while, because we're going to go from a named entity to a nameless people, literally to numbers. And it's so chilling. If you think about the Holocaust, how they take away their names and they give them numbers, it's all right here. He says, Rav ve'atzum, and this is the problem with the host countries when we're outside of our land, when we're outside of Eretz Israel. This is the thought of the enemy at some point. You know, when we came into Egypt, they welcomed us with open arms. They gave us sheep, and they gave us pastures, and they gave us honors. But now these words, Rav ve'atzum mimenu, can mean they are more plentiful than us, but more chillingly, mimenu. You know what they have? All their Rav, all their wealth, all of their prosperity, and all their strength and all their holdings. Mimenu, it's from us. It was ours. They took it from us. This is how you mobilize the troops. This is how you incite an upheaval. This is how you get people motivated. You say, you see those people? They have what's yours. What they're driving, what they're spending, what they're doing, all came out of your pocket. It's a little bit scary, but this is the rhetoric that's right here from thousands of years ago. And the next line is, Havanit hakema lo. I told you, they become an entity. They become a law. They're not going to have a name anymore. Let's outsmart them. Pen yirbeh, because if they come even more plentiful, v'haya ki tikrena milchama. Now, who might there possibly be a war with? We would think that this is just propaganda, that this is just a hypothetical fear, terrorism. They want to incite terror in the people and say, if there were to be a war, then they, gamhu, these nameless people, will join up al sonenu with our enemies, and they'll fight with us. And either ve'ala min haaretz could go either way. We'll talk about that for a minute. But why was this such a valid propaganda? Who might they actually join up with? They might actually say, hey, The old kings, the shepherd kings, the Hyksos king, that dynasty was very kind to the Jews. They allowed us to thrive and to multiply and to coexist and to live in peace. And the new king is saying, if they decide to team up either with the old king or with any other king, but I now understanding the history of it a little more, I believe they were afraid that the old governing powers might have had a chance of returning if they formed an allegiance with the Jews. And here they're saying if there was a milchama and they teamed up together, they would fight against us. That's for sure, nilcham banu. And then these last words, ve'ala min haaretz, is very scary. This is part of the dichotomy, part of the, I'm not sure, I'm ambivalent which way to read it because the text is going to let me read it both ways. On the one hand, they may leave. And if the Jews leave the country, we all know what happens. The economy goes, the stock market goes to the ground, everything's going to tank. So we need them on the one hand. But on the other hand, ve'ala min haaretz, if they stay, they may become so forceful that we, the Egyptians, may get thrown out of our own home. So they're in a quandary. They need us, but at the same time, we pose a huge threat. And as the verses continue, we see this same trend. Vayasimu alav, they put upon them. You notice how the names and the proper nouns are gone. Sareh misim. What do? We tax them. That's how we're gonna choke them, because if they are a financial liability to us in both ways, they're too rich. Yet if they're not here, everything goes to pot. So let's keep them here, but let's tax them, let them make money and give that money back to the treasuries. That would be an elegant solution in their eyes. Lema'an anoto, so we could torture them. And all of a sudden we went from sareh misim, from taxes, to lema'an anoto besivlotam. Whether these sivlot, whether these burdens are going to be physical burdens at this point, or financial, monetary burdens, so that they could build areh miskenot leparo. Let all of this money go to the national treasury in order to build. I told you that the Ramses II was known as the great builder. So he had a thirst for building. Let the money go towards his passion, which is building. But the more they tortured us, what happened? And again, this is what I started out saying. The more they torture us, the more ken yirbe, right? What was Paro's concern? Paro's concern was pen yirbe. Pen, they might. And what does happen? His greatest fear, ken yirbe, you better believe it, they did. The more they tried to decrease our number, the more our number increased. And he was saying that we are rav ve'atzum mimenu. And what happens to us? Vayirbu, vaya'atzmu. We become exactly, that self-fulfilling prophecy, exactly what he says is going to happen, ends up happening. And now we have this idea of physical labor. And so, Vayavidu Mitzrayim, this word avodah is going to appear in very close succession, exactly 5 times. Vayavidu Mitzrayim et Bnei Israel, be'avodah kasha, et kol avodatam asher avdu, ubechol avodah basadeh, and et kol avodatam asher avdu. Over and over, they're going to give us avodah, avodah, avodah. And you know what the response is going to be? Exactly as we would expect it. Because the next few verses have the words techayun. v'chaya, techayena, techaye, ki chayot hena. The more everything that they did, they gave us avodah to diminish us, we increased. They gave us avodah to obliterate us, and we were techayun. We end up being rebuilt. We're going to see this idea of a certain amount of verbs matched by the same number of verbs. And I believe that they're playing with each other, all of these verbs. So I want to take us straight. So we all know the story. Maybe we should take 2 minutes. Paro instructs his me'aldot. It seems like it's more clandestine. It's just in a quiet room, him and the nursemaids, the midwives, excuse me, whether they were Egyptian women who tended to the Jewish women or whether they were actually Jewish midwives. There is much to discuss about that. But regardless, the midwives refused to carry out Paro's decree, which is when the child is born, between you and the child, nobody's going to know what happened. The mother's not even going to know herself, and she's going to be there. When the baby comes out, press your finger maybe on the lung pipe or something, do something if it's a male, and make sure that it doesn't breathe or doesn't live. But the meyaldot end up having yirat ki yar'u hameyaldot et ha'elohim. They have a sense of awe in Elohim, and Hashem or Elohim blesses them. Vaya'as lahem batim. There's a lot written about it, whether it's houses of Kehunan Leviah, whether these midwives were Miriam and Yocheved, Shifran Pua, or whether it was commonly known that women who went into the practice of being midwives couldn't have children themselves, and therefore they were available at all times of the day and night to help others give birth, and as a result or as a reward, God gave them their own children. Regardless, this is once again a sense of sort of opposites. One thing is supposed to happen, and then the opposite thing happens. The babies are supposed to, not only do they not kill the babies, but vatechayena, which is so interesting. You know, I'll give you the pasuk, because when the meyaldot have this awe of God and they don't do what Melech Mitzrayim says, it says vatechayena et hayeladim. They don't just sit by passively and let nature take its course. Vatechayena, they play an active role in assuring that the baby is going to live. So even if there's some kind of difficulty in the birth, they're going to go out of their way to make sure, like in that kind of a case, if the pulse stopped or the child stopped breathing, okay. No, they took the extra measures, vatechayena, to revive these yeladim, which is actually a very beautiful way to look at these meyaldot. We call them, they're part of the tzidkei umot ha'olam, especially if they were, it's much greater to read them as Egyptian midwives, because then we get the sense and we're able to celebrate humanity and realize that not everybody's a monster like Paro. There are good people, and a human basic right to life was being preserved here. So that would be a very beautiful way to look at it. And we move forward and we go straight into, from these verses, we go into chapter 2, which talks about Moshe's birth. And again, I started to tell you, we started our Sefer with tons of names. There are names being thrown at us in every corner, in every at every turn. And then all of a sudden we get to Perek Bet. Nobody has a name. Vayelech ish mi bet Levi. Who is he? I have no idea. He takes a bat Levi. What's her name? I have no clue. There's a beautiful midrash that they had already been married, but Miriam got them back together. after the decree and said, if you don't get together, you're worse than Paro. He only decreed on the males, and you're not even allowing, maybe it's a female that's going to be born. All these are beautiful midrashim, but for today, I want to highlight this idea that in a book called Shemot, where everybody's name is so out there and on display, when it comes time for the Redeemer to be born, nobody has a name. I also like to read it. I think it's beautiful. It goes in keeping with the Torah's system, where b'makom she'en ish, in the place that there is no name, in the place that there is no mention of a name, you be the ish, you be the man, you be the person. So it's a insert your name here kind of opportunity, because if this is written for all generations, and this is saying, I'm going to tell you the story of the redemption of the generation in the 18th or 16th or 15th, now we're probably up to century BCE. But when you read this in your own day, you should know that there's room and space for every person's name to be included. So read yourself into this story, is what the Torah is saying. And Ish came from Bet Levi, he took a Bat Levi. The Isha, nameless, gives birth, and she gives birth Vateled ben, she gives birth to a son. Vatere oto, she sees him. Ki tovhu. Some people say Moshe's name was Tov, that he had many names, and this was one of his names. Or some people say that he was born with a Brit Milah. All of these are beautiful readings. Vatitzpinehu, she hides him for 3 months. A lot of the commentaries say that he was preemie, so she had the 3 months before they came to check on her. Velo yachla od hasefino, she could no longer hide him, maybe because her due date came up, and she takes a tevat gome. It's the only other place that we see a teva besides Noach, and she lines it with chemed and zefet, and she puts the child in there. She puts it on the sifat hayeor, and then she looks from afar. Who's looking? Vatetatsav achoto, his sister. We know the sister's name, but it's not mentioned here, Miriam. And she looks from afar, to see what's going to happen to him. And this is possibly one of my favorite lines of Torah, believe it or not. The idea that there's a decree that all males must be killed, because by the end of the last Perek was Vayitzav Paro. Paro just told all his people, because he had it already with the midwives, and he said, Kol haben hayelod hayirora tashlichuhu. Just throw them in the river. I'm not mincing words anymore. I'm not looking for CPR maneuvers. Just take the kid and drown it. And here, one of the cute, I would say, things about the mother of Moshe is she takes him and she puts him in the Ye'od. You told me to put him in the Ye'od. If you put her on the stand, then maybe she has a defense. I'm just following orders. You told me to put the kid in the Ye'od. Here you go. What do you want from my life? You didn't expect me to drown my kid. I didn't think you would mean something so monstrous. I thought you meant put them in the Ye'od. What you're going to do, I don't know. But that isn't the beautiful part of this. The Vatetatsav achoto merachok is so beautiful, because at a time when things seem so uncertain and so precarious, what is the sister doing? She's standing from afar to see what's going to happen to him. Lede'ah, she has da'at, she has the knowledge that something's going to be done for this child, and she wants to be around to see when it happens. She wants a front row seat. She knows, and this is one of the beautiful things, not just about Miriam, but about how a redemption happens, and that is we expect, we don't know how, where, why, or who, but we want a front row seat because we know that for certain There is going to be some type of happy ending, and we don't want to miss that. We have our camera focused and ready to record this story because we know there's going to be a story. And I can't learn about Miriam standing, just the picturing the scene of her brother on the water having a near-death experience. I can't help learn this without comparing it to another very, very similar story. And that other very similar story is the story of Yishmael. You see, Yishmael also has two mothers, a Jewish mother and an Egyptian mother. And Yishmael, his birth mother was tortured also before he was born, just like the Pharaoh tortured the Jews. Sarah, it says, Vate'aneha Sarai. She was also tortured, and both of them, Moshe and Yishmael, have a near-death experience. With Yishmael, Hagar actually says, Al er'eh bemot. I cannot stand around and see bemot hayeled. And she raises her voice and she cries. And why do I bring these two stories here? Is because in the one story where we have many similarities, but I'm just going to mention these few similarities where I'd like to suggest that what ends up taking place is there is some type of an improvement. Again, I can't say it's the same story, a Jewish mother and an Egyptian princess and a surrogate child, and both parents claiming ownership of the child, and torturing. I mean, there's a lot of things that take place. They almost die, and both kids are called a ben, a yeled, and a na'ad. There's a lot that takes place, and both children are about to die, and somebody's watching them from afar. They both grow up in the desert. There's a lot that goes on with the two of them that are similar. But I want to focus more, if this is a story about the Geula, about redemption, then part of the redemption means there needs to be an improvement. It can't be same old, same old. It can't be that what once was Ein Chadash Tachat Hashemesh. It's not going to be a here we go again, press the do-over button. It has to be what's old is now going to be new. How is this story? How is Shemot going to renew what took place in Bereshit? For a few things, we'll say, when Bat Paro, I'll start the opposite way. When Hagar has the child, Vateled Hagar le'Abraham ben, Vayikra Avram Shem beno. Avram calls the child and gives him the name Yishmael, even though the angel had told her that she was going to have a child and his name was going to be Ishmael. She's inactive. So this daughter of Paro, this Hagar in the story of Yishmael, is inactive, whereas a very big part of our story here, it's called the Book of Shemot, is Bat Paro, our new and improved daughter of Pharaoh, is going to be active, and she herself is going to name the child. And she herself is going to say, Vatikra Shemo Moshe, she's going to call him Moshe, and she's going to give a reason for his name. Names are very much indicative of what a person's ultimate destiny is going to be. And she says, Ki min hamayim mishitihu. I drew him, I pulled him out, I brought him out, I saved him from the waters. And we know that Moshe is going to be the one who's going to ultimately be the one who's going to save. And also specifically, there's going to be a Yam Suf. There is Mitzrayim, Mitzar Yam. We're going to be taking him out from the straits. I mean, there's so many ideas behind this, but what Sefer Shemot is going to start to tell us is the improvement factor, because that's where we need to go if we want to get to a place of redemption. And whereas Hagar finds herself in a place of torture, she escapes, she avoids, she runs away. Bnei Israel, when they're in that same vayanu, in that same place of torture, we end up thriving. Ken yirbe, ken yifrotz. And whereas Hagar, and this is what took us back to the Miriam story here, when Hagar has a sense of helplessness, and what do I mean by that? She takes the child, she puts it by the brush, and she says, Al ir'e b'mot hayeled, vatashov mineged vatisa et kola vatevk. What does Hagar do when her child is in a near-death situation? She raises her voice and she cries. Her cry is a cry of despair. And how do I know that? Because she herself said, I don't want to see the child in his death. What did she do? She wrote the script for the worst case scenario for her son, believed it to be true, and acted on it, and emotionally invested herself in her worst case scenario doom perspective. As opposed, so you're going to take the hopeless Hagar. What do we find in Shemot? The opposite. We're going to find the hopefulness. We're going to find the sister saying, I don't know how, why, or where, but something great is about to happen, and I don't want to miss 1 second of it. And so the daughter of Paro goes down to wash in the Ye'od with her maidens going with her. She sees the teva in the suf, vatishlach et amata, she stretches out her arm and she takes the teva. These words, vatishlach et amata, if we're going to have a residue of the Yishmael Hagar story, it's just so, there's just so many similarities. What happened with Hagar is that Sarah had said, Garesh et ha'ama ve'et bena. Chase, when you garesh, gerush, divorce, means I'll see you later and don't come back. My father used to say 2 orders, get out and stay out. That's what garesh et ha'ama, that's what Sarah asked Abraham to do with Yishmael. And God himself approved and sanctioned the act. But what does Abraham do? And that's why it's so magnificent. Even though he was supposed to garesh et ha'ama, do you know what he does? Vayishalcheha. He sends her. And how does he send her? He gives Hagar al shechma, on her shoulder, mayim and lechem. He sends her with kindness. He sends her with compassion. He sends her with life-saving supplies. And I'd like to suggest that because Abraham was sholeach et ha'ama, that he did shaliach, shalichut, he sent as opposed to garesh. Years later, this exact midah keneged midah, measure for measure, he was kind to the Egyptian princess. He sent out the Amah, and now vatishlach et amata. And now the Amah is going to be the one who's going to be sending out. And what is she going to send out? She's going to send out either her own self or somebody to retrieve and save who? The child or the grandchild of Abraham. The kindness is repaid directly to the one who gave the kindness in the first place. It's just so powerful that one small act that could be done by Abraham Avinu in giving bread and water and sending, as opposed to kicking and slamming the door, turned out to save not just this Moshe, but ultimately the entire nation. She sees the child, he's a Na'ad, and we have again the savvy, or you gotta love the sister. I always say, what was the difference between Moshe and Yishmael? Moshe had a sister. Don't underestimate the value of a sister, because this sister here, Miriam, what does she do? I mean, how creative do you have to be for her to go up to the daughter of Paro and say, would you like me to call a wet nurse for the child? Maybe I could help you out. And not only does she come up with an arrangement where her own mother is going to feed her own child, but she's going to be paid to do so. And why is that such an important piece? We didn't really need the gold coins in those days. They were slaves and really had nothing and nowhere to go. But if the Egyptian officials were to come and see Yocheved nursing a baby, what could she say? I'm being paid here. Where would I get these gold coins from? As slaves, they weren't being paid anything. So I'm being paid in the royal currency because I am feeding and nourishing her child. So she could do this at peace without having any danger for the child. And she ends up naming him, and his name becomes Moshe. And as he grows old, Bayamim Hahem, Vayigdal Moshe, same words as used with Ishmael, Halech V'Gadel, he grows up and he goes out to see his brothers. And like I said, we're pulled. Who's his brothers? The Egyptians are his brothers. The Jews are his brothers. He sees an Egyptian hitting a Ivri Me'echav. Who you want to ascribe the Echav to is open for discussion, but he looks this way and that way. He sees that there are no witnesses or ki ein ish, that there is nobody who is an adult in the room here, who is smart, who is capable of handling this. And he hits the Mitzri and he buries him in the sand. And on the next day, two men of the Jews come out and they're fighting and they accuse Moshe and they say, and Moshe says first to the Rasha, Lama takere'echa, why are you hitting your friend? He's your re'echa, he's one of yours. Don't you have enough enemies that you don't need to be each other's enemy? And the man answers him, Mi simcha le'ish sar v'shofet aleinu. Who died and made you boss over us? What are you going to do? Are you going to kill us the way you killed that other Mitzri yesterday? Moshe realizes the jig is up. Achen noda hadavar. The act that he had committed in killing the Egyptian is out. And he was afraid that if Paro should hear, or Vayishma Paro, that Paro did hear, either way it's bad, he has to run away, and he runs to Midian, and he goes to the famous Be'er. We always know that everywhere in text that you see a Be'er, you could be prepared for some kind of a Shidduch. They call it the water cooler, where they meet and they marry. That's exactly what happens. Over there, he sees the daughters of Yitro are being harassed, and he helps them out. He chases away the shepherds that are causing them trouble. He allows Yitros, or in this case, they call him Reuel. He allows Reuel's flock to be fed by his daughters. They come home and they tell their father what happened. And right away, the father says, I don't understand. You meet this Mr. Wonderful. I have 7 daughters. If you didn't count yet, there's no time to be, lax. We need to be vigilant. Anybody My mother says my grandmother used to say a broomstick with pants. Anybody who is of the male species, I have 7 daughters. My grandmother also had 7 daughters. So I had 7 daughters. I need to marry them. How could you let a good one like this, one who saved you without even knowing you and saved the flock, go get this guy? Anyway, he goes and he ends up marrying Sipporah for a wife, and she has a son, Vateled Ben, and he names him Gershom, and the first thing he says is, Ki ger hayiti be'eretz nochriah. I was a foreigner in that foreign place. I didn't belong there. Much as I was born in Egypt, I see myself as having been a foreigner, a fish out of water, if we could draw on that Menashe and Ephraim. He was totally out of his element there, even though, and again, here's the dichotomy, here's the opposites. The man is a prince, but at the same time, he is a fugitive. The man is born in Egypt, but he still at the same time feels like he is a foreigner. So in those days, the king of Mitzrayim dies, and it seems like the new king doubles down, and he gives them even harder work, to the point where Bnei Israel is finally going to cry out to God. And finally, we did all of this work to get us to this part, which is the burning bush. So Moshe is a shepherd, shepherding the sheep of his father-in-law Yitro, who was the priest of Midian. And he goes to the far reaches of the desert, and he comes as far as what's called Had HaElohim in Chorev. Now, there's a lot of ways to look at this story. It could be, and I would like to suggest as a possibility, maybe it was called Had HaElohim because it had a constant burning bush. And since there was always like a volcano, I had read a whole story about how Had HaElohim actually looked like a volcano, could have been a volcano, but that's a story for another day. There's a lot of hypotheses on what took place. For today, maybe just for our purposes, it was called Had HaElohim, the mountain of Elohim, because there had to be godliness on that mountain if there was a fire burning and not consuming the tree, the bush. That has to be something outside the realm of the normal. The only difference between everybody else who knew that that was Had HaElohim and Moshe is that Moshe was inquisitive, and he went closer to see what was this mar'eh. He needed to have to grab a handle on what was going on. I'll say it this way. Moshe was an intellect that did not accept things at face value. He needed to understand, I'll call it the science behind it. He wanted to understand how such a thing is possible. And when he got closer, an angel of God came within the fire, in the snare, and he says, and Moshe says to himself, Asurana, I have to look at this differently. As long as I'm approaching this situation from a place of science and the brain and rational and cause and effect, I'm not going to be able to process and understand what's going on. I need to asura. I need to see things differently. I need to understand, why is it why is it that the bush isn't being consumed? Now, does he come to his own realization? Does he write a theory and come up with the solution? Nobody, just having the question and being willing to go away from a place of logic and reason and saying there must be another way to understand this is what drew the next verse for. Vayad Hashem kisad lid'ot. God just saw that he was open to seeing things from a different perspective, and he calls him from within the snare. And here's the famous Vayomer Moshe, Moshe, and he calls to Moshe and he says, and Moshe answers, Hineni, I am here, I am present, I am accounted for. I am ready for every time we see the Avrahams, when we see the same name, Yaakov, mentioned twice, it means that God is calling you to task. That this is your shining moment. This is the reason you were created. So I'm going to say your name twice. One for who you were, and one for who you will be. You were named by the daughter of Pharaoh, Moshe. And that name of Moshe is a name that I'm going to give you, and it's going to hold for you as soon as you carry out this mission. And so let's talk about a minute this fire and bush and what was so intriguing about it. The bush could easily represent reality. This is what is. But the flame inside of the bush, right away, we're going to see, because the Malach Hashem is going to be Belabat Esh, inside the flame. So we have reality as the bush, and the flame is revelation, the word of God. And the bush has very often been compared to the Jews in suffering. And if the fire is going to be revelation or the voice of God or the Spirit of God, then it's going to depict for us this idea that God is together with us in our place of suffering. Though that thorn bush, picture it like a prison. It had like bars. It was impossible to come, like barbed wire, thorny. You couldn't come out of it. So God's saying, if you're in a place that you physically can't come out of, don't forget, I could come in and be in there with you, and we could be in there together. And we all know what happens when God's in the story. The bush doesn't stand the chance. The Egyptians don't stand the chance. So if we don't see a way out, it's a very beautiful change of perspective. And instead of saying, how am I going to get myself out of this mess? The bush could represent for us, how could I bring God in to my situation? And when I bring God into my situation, I have much better odds of having a solution. So the bush, we said, is sort of the natural. It's the natural, it grows, it's part of the earth. And the fire is this supernatural. But also the bush represents things that have a limited lifespan. They are temporal, they are consumable, they expire. But the flame, like the eternal flame, represents something that is enduring, that is infinite. And when we think of it that way, maybe the burning bush was a representation of humanity, where the bush is the body and the fire is the soul and the body is the encasement. And even if the body should extinguish and should cease to exist, the soul will always live on. And take it one step further, and not just the body, but the entire, not just, let's use the words Yaakov, but the entire Yisrael. The Yisrael, the Jewish people, will never be completely consumed, because God is the fire, because God is our soul, because God is our neshama. And so what the bush, I believe, is trying to depict for us is this idea of integration. We need to be able to say, problem, jail, hard spot. It's not two different things. It's not problem here and God out there. It's put them together, and all of a sudden you have a solution. The body needs a soul. Reality needs revelation, and the natural requires supernatural. We can't just operate with one alone. This is what God is telling, not just Moshe, but he's telling it to all of us. And it's most beautifully revealed when Aharon ends up uniting together with Moshe. I'm sorry I skipped a whole big part of it, but I see that the clock is ticking feverishly, so I'll be quick. Moshe and Aharon achieving this unification of brothers. I'd like to say if Moshe represents the one who draws from above to below, he brings from the mountain, from the top of Har Sinai, he's going to bring down the tablets. He's going to bring down the word of God to the people. He's we said the intellect who's going down from the mind. Everything he does starts from a place of mindfulness. Aharon, his brother, is the exact opposite of him. Abraham is the one who's always lifting from below to above. He lifts up the Aron. He lights the candles. They go up. He offers sacrifices from below to above. He's all live. He's all heart. V'samach belibo. Aharon is all heart. He stems from the heart. Moshe stems from the mind or from above. And the two of them come together and they create this magnificent unification. And it's this unification that's going to happen here by the burning bush. Sorry. That's going to represent for us the importance of integration, of uniting in order to bring the ultimate redemption. And so this integration and this unification, and I'll end with this, it has to happen across the board with people, with places, with things, with everything. It happens with Moshe and Aharon. It happens when we see, when we are in places and we see our homeland while we are in our exile. And we bring our morals and values and culture and language and names from our homeland into our exile, and we integrate the two, we will be able to go back to our homeland. And we see it also in the physical things like the fire and the bush, this coexistence of physical and spiritual, of Hashem with his people. And I entitled the class, "The Bush is Still Burning," because not just to say that the flame is still alive, but really what Sefer Shemot is beckoning us and asking us is the question, especially in a place of namelessness, is what are you going to do? What are we going to do? How are we going to fill our names into the story that's ultimately going to fan the flame, that's going to keep the supernatural, that's going to keep the Hashem, that's going to keep the miracles, that's going to keep all of this internal strength within us as a people, so that God willing together, our generation could be the ones who has, like Miriam, our cameras ready and positioned, because we're going to have to be the ones to say, I know something great is about to happen. I want a front row seat to that. When we have that attitude, great things will, God willing, ultimately happen for all of us soon. Bimhera b'yameinu. Amen. Thank you for